Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well, healthy and happy. So I thought we'd take a look today at the question of why it is that Islamic countries specifically have failed to develop. What is it that has caused this? There could be a number of factors at work here that is leading to the implosion of these societies in terms of certainly the civilian population. If we were to look at, let's say, countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia or virtually anywhere else really, we tend to see that the average IQ, which is probably a decent enough measure of intelligence, I would say. It has its drawbacks, but it does give you a general sense of the intellectual capabilities and capacities of any given population. And the average IQs in these countries is about 84. And that is worrying, because the average IQ in the West is about 90. And if you have an IQ of 79 or below, that is considered mental regression, mental retardation. Okay? That's the point at which you would say, well, someone's got severe learning difficulties. So, why is it that they are grappling with lower levels of intelligence? Well, there's a few issues at work here. I'm only going to be able to cover some of them, I think, but hopefully we'll do it justice. Now, one of the things that might be at play here is and this is a controversial topic, but it's the truth, right? It is the truth. So the number of marriages between cousins in Islamic societies, which is not only acceptable but promoted in the religious texts, it's encouraged essentially in the hadith and otherwise, and it's become adopted as a cultural phenomenon since then. So that phenomenon could account for potentially the regressive genes, the regressing intellect of the civilian populations in general. Now, we're speaking in generalities. There are some exceptional people in those societies. That is true. But those are the outliers. Those would be the outliers. Now, on this subject of inbreeding, there was research conducted by not only St. Luke's Hospital in Bradford, but several other hospitals in the UK, where they found that despite the fact that only 15% of the population in Bradford being of Pakistani origin, and one would therefore assume the majority being Muslims, because Pakistan's a Muslim majority country, an estimated 55% of people were married to their first cousins. Now, despite also the fact that British Pakistanis are responsible for only 3% of all births in the population, right? They only make up 3% of new births. Yet, they accounted for 30% of British children born with a genetic illness. Now, of course, we're talking about illnesses there. But could that also be having an effect on mental development or mental capacities in any way, shape, or form? I think it's easy to argue there's a very likely possibility. There's a very high likelihood that may in fact be happening. And no one's asking the question of whether these practices are fair to the children. whether they're born with disabilities or whether they're born with lower levels of intellect. Very few people, if any, are actually addressing any of this. Specifically on the question of intellect that we began with, there's another subject that is closely linked to this, and also to the genetic abnormalities and genetic illnesses as well, which is the nature of Islamic doctrine when it comes to genders. Okay, now I've discussed at length before how in human societies, women are the ones who choose their mating partner, which is very different from our other primate cousins. Okay, so women make the choice of mate based on a variety of selection criteria, and then they choose the individual with whom they would like to have children with, right? Now, you can talk about the merits of that. That's just nature, right? That's just the way it works. It's been observed many, many times by evolutionary biologists, evolutionary psychologists, anthropologists. This is generally the case in human society. However, with Islam, there is a distinct issue, namely that the woman does not get to choose her mate. The mate is chosen for her, and oftentimes even enforced upon her, which has all sorts of other problems that go along with that, of course, as well. Forced marriages and so on, arranged marriages, forced marriages, things that oftentimes end up being extraordinarily oppressive to both parties, but you also find that it doesn't lead to free choice in mate selection. Which means that, suppose that you have an educated woman, someone who is intelligent, someone who's capable of a great depth of understanding. She doesn't get a choice according, if one goes by the Islamic jurisprudence, the Sharia law, she doesn't actually get to have much of a choice in the selection of partner, right? Men and women don't get to mix in any way, shape or form, which causes some very real problems for, again, how partners are selected, right? Husbands and wives, and so forth, in their case. Because sex outside of marriage, of course, in Islamic context is deemed as extraordinarily sinful. Just the other day, I was reading a thing about someone in Indonesia who received the punishment of 100 lashes for being perceived, there was no evidence, but being perceived as having had relations outside of marriage. I mean, this is it's pretty barbaric stuff in one regard. But anyway, getting back on track on the actual subject we're talking about, this aversion to adhering to nature and the enforcement of their doctrine, the families involved oftentimes, or the male individual specifically, is the one who enforces his will, his choice of mating partner, his choice of spouse on the female, the woman, right? So that subverts nature. This is the thing, it subverts nature. See, nature does that, by the way, in humans for a reason. And that is so that the best possible selection criteria are met, and therefore the best genes are passed on to the next generations. But if you don't get a say in that at all, then that becomes a real issue. And oftentimes, by the way, men in those societies also find themselves, to some degree, being forced into situations that they are not completely happy with. And that's done by their families, by the culture, by the religion specifically, because the culture and the religion have become synonymous in regards to Islam, which is really, again, another worrying trend. But be that as it may, so the children that come out of those marriages where women don't get to choose their mate are not going to be the best, most capable individuals as nature would have chosen, right? So natural selection doesn't get an opportunity to operate in that society. So that's a major problem as well. And no one, as far as I know, has been talking about that. No one's talked about that. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty concerning that this is happening. So all of these things in conjunction have led to the people that are living in these geographic areas that obey these particular dogmas, these religious ideologies, the Islamic doctrine. Those people frequently find themselves hemmed in by their own, by the religion that they have been told they are, by their religion. It's designed to enslave them completely, mentally as well as physically. And then children suffer, you see, as a result of it. We've seen numerous examples of how children suffer because of other things that are going on with Islam as well. But this is another example of how children suffer as a result of it. It's a very, very toxic, very dangerous sort of belief system, I think, when it's orthodox and adopted wholesale in the way that it is. Because it doesn't allow for truth, it doesn't allow for freedom, it doesn't allow for anything. It's absolutely totalitarian. Interestingly enough, I don't see feminists or leftists protesting the absolutely shameful way that women are being treated under Islamic laws in Islamic countries. Whether it's these issues, whether it's female genital mutilation, I don't see any of them doing anything about that at all. It's very, very, very troubling to see that being the case, where people, because they want a virtue signal, call themselves feminists. They want to destroy the patriarchy, which doesn't exist in the West, right? This mythical patriarchy that they keep wanting to rip down, but they will never, ever, ever confront the real atrocities that are taking place against women by these totalitarian regimes, these totalitarian religions. They just won't confront it. Maybe it's because they're afraid, because they know what would happen if they did. Right? Straight away, they'd be subject to death sentences and all sorts of things. You know? But I was thinking about something else when it comes to this stuff as well. That the lower the intelligence of the average population, then the lower the earning capacity as well, right? The more birth defects they've got also, the more health concerns there are, the less capable they are of working or educating themselves or doing anything. So there's a variety of things that are linked to this subject. The very few people are courageous enough or are willing enough to really explore. And they are a major issue. Right? They're a really serious problem. Because it's causing... See, this is the other thing. It's causing extreme suffering. And it's causing suffering not to the West directly necessarily, although it does with the export of these ideologies, but it's causing the greatest damage to Muslims. Muslims are being damaged by these concepts, these ideologies, these belief systems, these totalitarian ideologues who usurp power from what were previously democratic regimes or democratic governmental systems and make them into theocracies, as happened in Iran, for example, which was secular originally, right? The Persian people were very proud of their culture. In comes Khomeini, and lo and behold, after this whole thing that happened with the deposition of the Shah of Iran, suddenly today you can't walk outside without putting burqas on if you're a woman, or you get stoned to death or punished in many other ways. It's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. But the point being that you can't, see, totalitarianism, right, always stifles development. It always stifles it, whether it's entrepreneurial, creative, creativity gets stifled. You get people that really want to work hard, educate themselves academically. That also gets stifled because there's only certain things you can study. You can't study other things. If you've got a vehemently anti-science agenda that couples with your religion, then obviously you're limited in the scientific fields you can explore, the purposes for which you can explore them. All kinds of things come into that. And so this is what is stifling development in Islamic countries, right? I think this is why they're failing to develop. It's a conglomeration of all these different things. It's the cousin marriages, it's the genetic defects, it's the lack of choice of mating partner, where a woman might choose the most intelligent man to mate with or the most successful man to mate with that would guarantee her the best genes for her children, her offspring, right? But that doesn't get to express itself there, so that's gone. And it's really all a bit of a mess, because what's now directly happening, of course, we've seen this with the flood of migrants that have come in from these Islamic theocracies, or the democracies that were under attack by Islamic theocracies. We've seen those people flood into Europe. And then you see these terrorist acts taking place everywhere. Now, here's another interesting fact for you. According to the US government's National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC, Muslims suffered between 82 and 97% of terrorism-related fatalities over the past 5 years. So the greatest number of victims of Islamism and terrorism are Muslims themselves. The greatest victims of these ideologies are always the Muslims first. It's a little bit like Nazi Germany. You didn't see people always get this wrong. They assume that the first victims of these totalitarian regimes were the people that were killed in the gas chambers, right? Jews, homosexuals, the disabled, a myriad of other persons that were not in agreement with that totalitarian state. Or in Soviet Russia, again, people assume the same thing about that it was, the first victims were the people that were killed. No, actually, in the cases of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Mao's China, the first victims were the population who were duped into believing the garbage and then suffering the consequences of that garbage that they themselves had invested in. And this is the other thing about the ideology, is that once you have a dumb enough population Once you have a population that is incapable of critical thinking, which any population that is teetering around 84 in terms of IQ points is, then it becomes remarkably easy to enslave that population by giving them this utopian, idealized vision of what their theocratic system is going to create and produce, which is what these Islamists do, these Islamic leaders. They're enslaving the minds of Muslims everywhere, and they are causing them great damage. And no one in the West, insofar as the leftists are concerned, is objecting to it. I find that repugnant. When you've got children suffering from birth defects as a result of dire practices, when you've got kids suffering, especially girls suffering female genital mutilation as a result of a religion, and you don't hear anyone in the West who's a leftist speaking out, that is troubling. If you're not speaking up for the children, my God, what do you stand for? That becomes my question to you. What do you stand for? If you're not doing something to try and prevent those horrendous practices from really causing suffering, what is the point of you being on this earth? This becomes my question. And I'm only half joking about that, by the way. But on the subject of Islam, I'll say this as well before I wrap up. Because if we're going to talk about Islamic countries and their failure to develop, then we have to talk about the belief system that governs them. We just have to. There's no escaping that, unfortunately. Because these things are inextricably linked. They really are. With regards to Islam, here's an interesting fact for you, which you may not be aware of because probably no one has told you this. See, people even in the West assume that Islam is a long-standing religion that has literally been around since the time of Muhammad. Okay? People think and believe that. And it's the greatest con of all time. It is literally the greatest con of all time. And you have no clue about how major that is. But I'll give you a taste of it. So, prior to 1924, Islam, at least as has become understood in the current incarnation, Islam did not exist. And a lot of people will object to my saying that because they do not know the facts. They do not know the facts. See, today's Islam is very different from what it was before 1924. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't barbaric before. It doesn't mean that the Islamic Empire did not exist before, that had been traditionalized. It doesn't mean that the Ottoman Empire didn't commit horrendous atrocities. It doesn't mean that the barbars didn't commit horrendous atrocities. The point being, those were empirical wars between empires. And everyone was doing it. Let's face it, everyone was doing it, right? I mean, my goodness, up until recently we had all sorts of wars for empire, right? Every country was at war trying to expand its empire. It's not a bad thing. That's how we progress generally. The better empire, hopefully, generally tends to win, right? So, that's neither here nor there. The point is that this codified text from which everything has come, that being the 1924 Cairo edition of the Quran, only came into being in 1924. The same thing, generally speaking, is very true of the Hadith, the secondary books in Islam. Again, a lot of people don't know that, right? Those were only codified in the, I believe it was the 8th or 9th century. That's well 100 years or 200 years after Muhammad died, right? So the veracity of any of these documents or documentations can't necessarily be proven. That's a big issue. And this is why you find that in terms of what exists today to verify the existence of some sort of original Quran, right? There are 4 manuscripts. You have the Ma'il manuscript, the Codex. You've got the Samarkand Codex. You've got the Topkapi Codex, and you've got the Cairo Codex, the original Cairo Codex. All 4 of those are completely different texts, by the way. None of them are the same. Not one. And nobody bats an eyelid at that. Nobody bats an eyelid. Because nobody's being told about this. What's happened is that Al-Azhar University, right, which has become the predominant academic institution for studying Islam, which is where al-Baghdadi, by the way, got his 2 doctorates. That is dictating to the West what Islamic history was and is. Right? They made it up out of thin air. You have to understand this. And we accepted it hook, line, and sinker without thinking twice about it. Right? Like I said, it's the biggest con of all time. And these manuscripts I was talking about, these codex, all of them have been verified as having come about far later than the time of Muhammad himself. There are several scholars, including John Wansborough, Michael Cook, and Patricia Crone. Every one of them have verified this. Do you ever hear about it? No, because it's incendiary, right? And I'll tell you why it's incendiary as well while we're on the subject. It's incendiary because Muslims themselves have been conned completely into believing in this thing called Islam as we see it today, right? Islamism, right? The current form of Islam is Islamism, it's extremism, it's fanaticism, and it fundamentally leads to terrorism. It really does, right? But they've been conned into believing that the Quran that they've got in their homes, in their hands, the one that they read, the one they memorize, is the very same original Quran that existed from the beginning when it was supposedly revealed to Muhammad. It's not. Okay, but they don't know that. And the reason they don't know that is because the Cairo edition stipulates that there is a copy of the Quran kept in heaven that can never ever be changed. And if any man tries to change it on earth, then the good Lord, apparently Allah, as they believe, would smite humanity and preserve the Quran. Which is a load of hokum and tosh, right? But because of that, they are incapable of seeing that there might be errors in the Quran that they're reading. Okay, it's a little bit like this. And one of the reasons why they believe so strongly in it is because of what I'm going to describe here. So I like to give the example of the Pepsi bottle, right? If I go up to a guy born in the 80s or the 90s, right, and I stick a bottle of Pepsi in front of him, and I say, do you know there was a time when that Pepsi did not exist? And I'm not endorsing any products, by the way, right? Do you know there was a time when Pepsi didn't exist? That guy would look at me like I've lost my damn marbles. He'd say to me, what are you talking about? Pepsi has always been there. Since I was born, Pepsi was there. And he's half correct, right? Since he was born, he's been used to Pepsi being there. He cannot fathom a time, he cannot imagine a time when Pepsi did not exist. Now, the older people maybe remember that there was a time when Pepsi didn't exist, right, as a brand. The point being, for most people, it's almost, if not literally, virtually impossible for them to think of a time before something they've known their whole lives existed. It's one of the limitations of being a human being. We can only verify those things that we are comfortable with and have always known, right? What happened before, we don't know. And this is why we rely so heavily on science and history, historical facts. But what happens if you're not taught true historical facts? What happens if the only thing you hear is propaganda? What happens when the theocrats decide to tell you exactly their version of events, which bear no relation to reality, and are vehemently false? Because that's what's happened in the Islamic world. That's actually what's happened. See, here's the country that's been doing it all. Saudi Arabia. You see, after the publication of the 1924 edition of the Quran, there was a pact made between the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and the Saudi royal dynasty. A lot of people don't know about these facts. They really are actually verifiable if you go and look them up, but they're just not, people aren't told these things. The Saudi government was installed into power by the British, Lawrence of Arabia and so on, right? And the reason it's called Saudi Arabia, that country, is because the House of Saud were the ones that we favoured in amassing power in that region among the Bedouin tribes. That's what happened. Hence Saudi Arabia, right? But again, people don't know this stuff. People aren't told this stuff. And it's sad to see that level of ignorance among people. But the Saudis got into power because they made a deal with the theocrats of that time. And it was because of the theocracy that they were able to amass the amount of power that they did. And the theocrats played a very big hand, not only in the installation of the Saudi royal family, but in the creation of this current version of Islamism. Right? And these are the same theocrats that insisted on the publication of the 24 Cairo edition Quran. They're the same theocrats that created a religion and a history out of thin air. They're the same theocrats that built the city of Mecca, which didn't exist before. Right? All the same theocrats. If you want to study up on this, by the way, there's a great book I would recommend to you called In the Shadow of the Sword. In the Shadow of the Sword by Tom Holland. And he makes a great job of explaining a lot of this. He's a historian. But not many people know about his work, right? Same as the other scholars I mentioned, who are very well lauded, by the way, as scientists and historians. So this is what took place. And one of the reasons I'm telling you all of this is because this current carnage that we are seeing, this lack of development, this usage of power, the usurping of power by these theocrats, the damage that's taking place in the West because of it all, stemmed from this. Someone, to put it simply, someone invented Islamism for their benefit, okay? And when that happened, and it only happened in the last 100 years, by the way, as I explained, when that happened, everything changed. Okay, you saw mass shifts of global power because of it. And the people who came up with it are far smarter and far cleverer than most people alive today. Because they're master manipulators. They have a master mind, right? This is I'll maybe speak about this more in future videos. The point being, they have a master hive mind. And what happens is, when they conceive of a plan and they implement that plan, they're not thinking about a year down the line, tomorrow, the next month, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. They're thinking hundreds of years down the line. They really are. But many of you probably just won't get that right now, and that's okay, you know. Oftentimes it takes a lot of real understanding and knowledge being presented to you before you start to realize how this world has truly been shaped and what is going on in it. But as I say, the greatest atrocities that happened because of Islam happened to Muslims. And then we see these same barbarities as it spreads occurring in the West. So everyone loses. It's a zero-sum game. And that's part of the reason why we have to be honest about the conversations we have surrounding Islam, surrounding Islamism, surrounding all of these things, which no one wants to do. Right? No one wants to do that because it potentially means a death sentence. And that's not a fun thing for most people to contemplate, right? Because these theocrats are pretty dangerous people. Look at what happened to Salman Rushdie. All he did was write a book, and they issued a fatwa declaring that it was permissible for any Muslim to kill him. In fact, it was encouraged that he should be put to death just for writing a book of fiction. Look what happened to Theo van Gogh, the great-grandson of Vincent van Gogh. Killed just for trying to make a film. You don't have to go far to see the amount of carnage that these ideologies have wreaked right across the world. The same thing's happening in Africa. You've got this issue with Boko Haram right now, and numerous other groups in Nigeria, throughout the Congo, throughout Somalia, Sudan. It's not a good situation. So this is why I'm saying you have to get really clued up on the facts of what is going on. And in each case, the countries that we're talking about, the countries that we've mentioned throughout this video, are imploding. They're becoming failed states at a very fast rate, right? Because it's a self-annihilating doctrine. That's the problem with it. It's self-annihilating as a doctrine. It's nihilistic, like I explained in one of my previous videos just very recently, a couple of days ago. But we have to stand up, we have to tell the truth, we have to speak the truth, we have to stand up for freedom. And why do we have to do all these things? Because we want to actually try and guarantee our survival. It's in our self-interest, it's in our best interests to speak truth to power and to keep doing it. Okay? It's in our best interests. It guarantees the survival of ourselves, of our children, our children's children. It will guarantee the survival of the West as a whole. If we don't do that, if we sit back, if we just accept everything that's going on, then, my God, the level of atrocity will continue to build. Not just against the West, but against all Muslims as well. You'll see horrendous things happening. One final point I'll make, because I keep thinking of new things here. I keep thinking of new things. One final point I will make about this, because I'm just literally doing this on the fly, is right off the cuff, is this. You see, the amount of Western intervention in all of these Islamic countries has been devastating. We have totally destabilized, because of the military-industrial complex, its need for war. It has utterly destabilized these countries. It destroyed the schools, the hospitals, the infrastructure, the roads. It's all gone to hell. That has contributed massively to fueling anti-Western sentiment. It really has, right? And that's no joke. That's also going on, right? It's as real as the other stuff we talked about in terms of the totalitarianism. This is part of the reason, again, why we have to vehemently hold strong to preventing the expansionist ideals of certain war hawks in government. Can't allow it. Right? It's one thing to fight a truly defensive war, and there is no one who is sane in the right mind that would object to that, because you must absolutely fight for freedom, for truth, for your family, for yourself, for your community, for your society. Absolutely. Right? But that's a defensive war. When someone directly attacks you, you have every right to retaliate. Every right. But at the same time, if you look at what the heck's been going on, it's been a case of offensive wars. It's not defensive warfare, it's offensive warfare, under the pretext that it was a defensive war, by the way. That's what makes it so clever. That's why people in these Western populations fell for it. Example, the invasion of Iraq, right? You were fooled into thinking that you had to do it in order to defend and protect your country because of weapons of mass destruction, of which there were none. No nuclear weapons, no chemical weapons, no biological weapons, nothing, right? But the pretext was necessary, wasn't it, for regime change? So this is why I'm saying you have to be really, really careful, because you have to keep an eye on your politicians as well. Probably most politicians, in fact, because they're corrupt, they're decadent, they are damaged by greed and a lust for power. And those are not people you can trust. They must always be held to account and be accountable to the public. We in the West should have the intelligence to be able to do that. But unfortunately, even here, it's dwindling fast because leftist ideology has been taken over. Has been taking over in academic institutions and government positions and intelligence agencies. It's just run rampant. And this is the thing of it. So if we're not very careful, we'll end up in the same boat as the Islamic countries. This is what I'm trying to tell you all. And I'll end this video on that point. We are safeguarding against turning into one of those Islamic fanatical states. Okay? Anyway, I hope that's been informative in some sense and that you've gotten something out of this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Take good care and God bless you.